Hi friend, welcome to the live study. So I am going to discuss about Spring Boot interview question second part. My first question is explain Spring Initializr and its advantage. Spring Initializr is a cool feature of Spring Boot with the help of which you can see what is happening inside a running application. So, whenever you want to debug your application and need to analyze the log, you need to understand what is happening in the application, right? In such a scenario, the Spring Initializr provides easy access to features such as identifying beans, CPU usage, etc. The Spring Initializr provides a very easy way to access the production ready RESTful points and fetch all kind of information from the web. These points are secure using the Spring Boot's content negotiation strategy. But the main question is arise, what is a Spring Boot Initializr, right? The Spring Boot Initializr is a sub-project of the additional feature that help us to monitor and manage the Spring Boot application. It contains the Initializr endpoints. Endpoints means the place where the resources live. We can use HTTP and JMX endpoint to manage and monitor the Spring Boot application. If we want to get production ready features in an application, we should the Spring Boot application. Means you should use Spring Boot Initializr. But there are mainly three main point feature. There are three main feature of Spring Boot Initializr. The first is the endpoints, second is matrix, and third is addition. Endpoints means generally some interviewer ask the questions what is the endpoints? It's a little bit just one line description. Endpoint is allow us to monitor and interact with the application. Okay. Move to the another question. Another question is what are the Spring Boot starters and what are available in a starter? So Spring Boot starter are a set of convenient dependency management providers which can be used in an application to enable dependency. These starters make development easy and rapid. All the available starters come under the org Spring framework.boot group. The few of popular starter are as follow. Popular starter already shown on the desktop in the monitor. The first point is Spring Boot starter. Second point, Spring Boot starter JDBC, Spring Boot starter web, Spring Boot starter data JPA, Spring Boot starter security, Spring Boot starter AOP, Spring Boot starter test. There are some popular starter. Okay. So the question is Spring Boot starter. This is a core starter and include login, auto configuration, support, and YML. YML means if you want to use YML, then you can change application.properties file. Okay. Second is Spring Boot starter JDBC. This starter is used to Heikel CP connection pool with the JDBC. So third is the Spring Boot starter web. This starter for building web application including RESTful APIs. Application using Spring. Data JPA. This is the starter to use Spring Data JPA with a Hibernate JPA repository. Okay. Security. This is starter used for the Spring Security Starter AOP. This starter is used for aspect-oriented programming with the aspect J and Spring OAP. Spring test. This the starter of testing Spring application. Move to the another question. Another question is what is the need for Spring Boot dev tools? Dev tools means development tools. Spring Boot dev tools are an elaborated set of tools and aim to make the process of developing an application easier. If the application runs in the production, then this module is automatically disabled. Right? Repackaging of achieve are also excluded by default, so the Spring Boot developer tools applies properties to the respective development environment. To include the dev tools, you just have to add the following dependency in the form.xml files. Means if you use the dependency, they definitely use the artificial ID like Spring Boot dev tools, right? Dependency. I'm just first questions I'm discussing. I have already discussed in the first question is the Spring Boot starter. Okay. Move to the another question. Another question is how can we create a custom endpoint in a Spring Boot accurator? It's a very good question for the interview rooms. To create a custom endpoint in a Spring Boot 2.3.5, you can use the @endpoint annotation. Spring Boot also expose endpoint using the @web pointer web pointer extension over HTTP with the help of Spring MVC. Jersey. Okay. Move to the another question. Another question is what do you understand by auto configuration in a Spring Boot and how to disable auto configuration? Okay. Auto configuration is used to automatically configure the required configuration for all the applications. For example, if you have a data source being represented in a class path of the application, then it automatically configure the JDBC template with the help of auto configuration. You can create a Java application in an easy way as it automatically configure the required beans, controllers, etc. To disable the auto configuration property, you have to exclusive attribute of @enable auto configuration in the scenario where you do not want it to be applied, like @enable auto configuration exceeded is equal to data source auto configuration dot class file. If the class is not on the class path, then to exclude the auto configuration, you have to mention the following codes like @enable auto configuration exclude name is equal to simple dot class file, right? Apart from this, Spring Boot also provides the facility to exclude list of auto configuration classes by using the Spring Boot auto configuration.exclude property. You can go forward and add it either in an application.properties file or add multiple class files with the common separated. Okay, move to the another question. Another question is, what are the difference between @Spring Boot application and @enable auto configuration? Spring Boot is used in the main class or bootstrap class, but enable auto configuration used to enable auto configuration and component scanning in your project. Spring Boot application, it is a combination of @configuration, @component scan and @auto configuration and annotations. But enable auto configuration is a combination of @configuration and @component scan. but the main difference are both are similar. Like the Spring Boot does much more than what enable auto configuration do. The Spring Boot application actually a combination of three annotations. The first annotation is @configuration, second is @component scan, and third is enable auto configurations. Okay, listen carefully. The Spring Boot designer realized that these annotations are frequently used together, so they bundle them into Spring Boot application. Now in need of three annotations, we just need to specify one annotation on our main class. Main class, okay, means Spring Boot application. Okay, Spring Boot application. But some difference actually, there are using some different like first is availability, purpose, usage and control. Move to the another question. Another question is question number 7. Can you give an example for read only as true in a transaction measurement? For example, for read only as a true in a transaction measurement could be as a follow. Like consider a scenario where you have to read data from the database. For example, let us say you have a customer database and you want to read the customer details such as customer ID and a customer name and customer address and customer education details. To do that, you will set read only on the transaction, as we do not want to check for the changes in the entity, right? Move to the another question. Another question is, can you explain how to deploy to a different server with the Spring Boot? To deploy a different server with the Spring Boot, follow the below steps, like generate a WAR file from the project, then deploy the WAR file onto your favorite server. Note the steps to deploy the WAR file on the server independent on the server you choose. So another question is, what is the best way to expose custom application configuration with the Spring Boot? One way to expose the custom application configuration in a Spring Boot is by using the @value annotation, but the only problem with the annotation is that all the configuration values will be distributed throughout the application. Instead, you can use a centralized approach. By centralized approach, I mean that you can define a configuration component using the @configuration properties as follow: @component, @configuration properties. It's a live demo. Just create a class like a public class simple configuration. Is just such use the like a private, like numbers, value, message. According to the above snapped, the value configured in an application.properties file will be as a follow, like a demo, live demo.numbers, like 100 anything, live demo.value true, live demo message.dynamic message. Okay, move to the another question. Just discuss the question number 10. Can we create a non-web application in Spring Boot? It is possible. Can you? Just I'm repeating again. Can we create a non-web application in Spring Boot? Answer is yes. Can you explain? Right. We can create a non-application by removing the web dependency from the class path along with changing the way Spring creates the application context. Okay. In a Spring Boot, to create a non-web applications, implements the command line runner and override them the run method. For example, import org.springframework.command line runner. Just write the @Spring Boot application. Just create the main class like public class Spring Boot demo application implements command line runner. Just create like public static void main Spring arg throughout exceptions. Then just create the method run method like Spring application.run Spring Boot demo application.class org. Just if you want access command line argument, then I just override like public void run method Spring org through the exception. Do something. Another question is maintain the advantage of YML file, then properties file, and the different way to load YML file in a Spring Boot. The advantage of YML file, then a property file, is that the data is stored in a hierarchical format, so it becomes very easy for the developer to debug if there is an issue. The Spring Boot class supports the YML file as an alternative to properties whenever you use the Snap YML library on your class path. The different way to load a YML file in a Spring Boot is as follow, like use YML map factory bin to load YML as a map, use YML properties factory bin to load YML as a properties. Another question is how is Hibernate chosen as the default implementation for JPA without any configuration? When we use the Spring Boot auto configuration, automatically the Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency as dependency gets added to the pom.xml file. Now, since this dependency has a transitive dependency on JPA and Hibernate, Spring Boot automatically auto-configure Hibernate as the default implementation for JPA whenever it sees Hibernate in a class path. Another question is how to instruct an auto configuration to back off when a bean exists. To instruct an auto configuration class to back off when a bean exists, you have to use the @conditional on missing bean annotation. The attributes of this annotation are as follows. Value names. The value is this attribute stores the type of beans to be checked. Name. This attribute stores the name of beans to checked. Another question is why is Spring Data REST not recommended in a real world application? Very most important question for your interview rooms. Spring Data REST is not recommended in a real world applications as you are exposing your database entity directly as a REST services. While designing RESTful services, the two most important things that we consider in the domain model and the consumers, but while using Spring Data REST, none of these parameters are considered. The entities are directly exposed, so I would just say you can use Spring Data REST for the initial evolution of the project. Another question is, what do you think is the need for profile? What do you, I'm repeating again, what do you think is the need for profiles? Profiles are used to provide a way to segregate the different parts of the application configuration and make it available for various environments. So basically any component or a configuration can be marked with a profile. To limit as it is loaded, consider you have multiple environments like dev, like development, QA, stage, production. Now let's say you want to have different application configuration in each of the environment. You can use profile to have different application configuration for different environments. So basically Spring and Spring Boot provides features through which you can specify the active profile for a specific environment, the configuration of various environment for various profile. Okay, just complete my second part is Spring Boot interview questions. So thank you for the valuable response and thank you for listening is